Hi there, this is Jesse Johnson from Tutoring with a Twist, and we're going to be continuing our reading of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne today. So, last time we had read the first three chapters, where we were introduced to the narrator, Axel, a young geological apprentice, as well as his uncle, Professor Otto Lidenbrock. And they had just found a certain scrap of paper hidden inside of an old Icelandic tome that had some sort of runic cipher on it, and they had just started to attempt to decode what it might say. So, picking up right from where we left off, this is Chapter 4, The Enemy to be Starved into Submission. "Has he gone?" called Martha, running out of her kitchen at the noise of the violent slamming of the doors that had shaken the whole house. "Oh yes," I replied, "completely gone." "But what about his dinner?" said the old servant. "He's not having any." "And his supper?" "He's not having any." "What?" cried Martha, clasping her hands. "No, my dear Martha, he will eat nothing more. No one in the house is to eat anything at all. Uncle Lidenbrock has put us all on a strict diet until he has succeeded in deciphering an undecipherable scrawl." "Oh, heavens! Are we all to die of hunger, then?" I couldn't bring myself to admit that, with so absolute a ruler as my uncle, such a fate was inevitable. The old servant, visibly disturbed, returned to her kitchen, moaning pitifully. Alone once more, I thought of going and telling Gräuben all about it. But how could I leave the house? The professor might return at any moment. And supposing he called for me? Supposing he wanted to start work on this word puzzle again, a puzzle which would have taxed even old Oedipus? And if I wasn't there to answer his call, who knows what might happen? The wisest course was to remain where I was. A mineralogist in Besançon had just sent us a collection of Cecilia's geodes, which I had to classify. So I set to work, sorting and labeling all these hollow specimens and arranging them in a glass case. Inside each hollow geode was a nest of little crystals. But this work didn't occupy my whole attention. The business with that old document kept going round and round in my brain. My head was throbbing with excitement, and I felt vaguely uneasy. I was gripped by a feeling of impending disaster. An hour later, my geodes were all arranged on the shelves. Then I flopped into the old velvet armchair, with my head back and my arms hanging over the sides. I lit my long, curved pipe, the bowl of which was carved in the likeness of a reclining water nymph. Then I amused myself, watching the tobacco turn to carbon, a process which was also slowly turning my nymph into a negress. Now and then, I listened for those well-known footsteps on the stairs, but there wasn't a sound. Where could my uncle be? I imagined him running along under the magnificent trees which lined the road to Altonia, gesticulating wildly, shooting at the walls with his cane, thrashing the long grass, cutting the heads off the thistles, and disturbing the peace of the solitary storks. Would he return in triumph or discouragement? Which of the two would get the upper hand, him or the secret? Sitting, pondering such questions, without thinking, I picked up the sheet of paper on which I had written the incomprehensible succession of letters, and I repeated to myself, "What does it all mean?" I tried to group the letters so as to form words. Quite impossible. Whether I put them together in twos, threes, fives, or sixes, I got nothing but nonsense. Certainly, the 14th, 15th, and 16th letters made the English word ice. The 84th letter and the next two made sir, and in the middle of the document, in the second and third lines, I noticed the Latin words rota, mutabile, ira, nec, and atra. Right, I thought. These words seemed to justify my uncle's idea about the language of the document. And the last time I could see the word luco, which means a sacred wood. In the same time, there was the word tabilid, which looks like Hebrew, also the French words mère, arc, and mère. It was enough to drive a poor fellow crazy. 4 different languages in this ridiculous sentence. What connection could there possibly be between such words as ice, sir, angle, cruel, sacred wood, changeable, mother, bow, and sea? The first and the last might have something to do with each other. It was not at all surprising that in a document written in Iceland there should be a mention of a sea of ice. But it was quite another thing to get to the meaning of this cryptogram from so small a clue. So I was struggling with an insurmountable difficulty. My brain was overheating, my eyes were blinking over that sheet of paper. Its 132 letters seemed to flutter and fly around me like those silvery drops which float in the air around your head when there's a sudden violent rush of blood to the brain. I was prey to some kind of hallucination. I was suffocating. I needed air. Absent-mindedly, I fanned myself with the bit of paper, the back and front of which alternately passed before my eyes. Imagine my surprise then, in one of those rapid movements, just as the back of the paper was turned towards me, I thought I could make out perfectly readable words, such as the Latin words carcerem and terrestre. Suddenly the penny dropped. These mere hints gave me the first glimpse of the truth. I discovered the key to the cipher. To read the document, it would not even be necessary to read it through the paper. It could be spelt out with ease, just as it was, just as it had been dictated to me. All those igneous professional contributions were coming to fruition. He was right about the arrangement of the letters. He was right about the language. He had been within a hair's breadth of reading this Latin sentence from beginning to end, but the crossing of that hair's breadth chance had given to me. Was I excited? I certainly was. My eyes were blurring so much I could hardly see. I had spread out the paper on the table. I would only have to glance over it to know the whole secret. At last, I became calmer. I made myself walk twice round the room quietly to settle my nerves, and then I sat down again in the huge, deep armchair. I took a deep breath and then said to myself, "Now let's read it." I leaned over the table, placed my finger on every letter in turn, and without a pause, without a moment's hesitation, I read out the whole sentence. What amazement and what terror overwhelmed me! It was as if I had suddenly received a sudden mortal blow. What? Had I really read... Excuse me, let me take another go at that paragraph. What amazement and what terror overwhelmed me! It was as if I had suddenly received a sudden mortal blow. What? Had what I had read really actually been done? A mortal man had the audacity to penetrate... Oh no, I cried, jumping up. No, no, no. My uncle must never know about such an incredible journey. He'd insist on doing it too. He's such a determined geologist, ropes couldn't hold him back. He'd start out in spite of everything and everybody. And he'd take me with him, and we'd never get back again. No, never, never. My agitation was beyond all description. No, no, I won't let it happen, I declared emphatically. And, since it's in my power to prevent knowledge of it reaching the mind of my tyrant, I'll do it. By dint of turning this document round and round, he too might discover the key. I'll destroy it. There was a little fire left in the hearth. I picked up not only the piece of paper, but Saknussemm's parchment as well. Feverishly, I was just about to fling it onto all the coals and utterly destroy this dangerous secret when the study door opened and in walked my uncle. Chapter 5. Famine, then victory, followed by dismay. I only just had time to put the wretched document back on the table. Professor Lidenbrock seemed to be completely preoccupied. His obsession was giving him no rest. Evidently, he had gone deeply into the matter, with careful thought and analysis. He had brought all the resources of his mind to bear upon it during his walk, and he had come back to apply some new combination to the cipher. He sat in his armchair, and pen in hand, he began to write what looked very much like algebraic formulae. My eyes followed his trembling hands. I noted every movement. Might not some unexpected result come of this? I too trembled, but quite unnecessarily, since the true key was in my hands, and no other key would unlock the secret. For 3 long hours, my uncle worked on without a word, without even looking up, rubbing out what he had written, beginning again, and then rubbing it all out again, and so on 100 times. I knew very well that if he succeeded in writing down these letters in every possible relative position, he would eventually create the correct sequence. But I also knew that 20 letters alone could form 2 quintillion, 432 quadrillion, 902 trillion, 8,176,640,000 combinations. Now, there were 132 letters in this sentence, and these 132 letters would give a number of different sentences, each made up of at least 133 letters, a number almost larger than one could imagine. So I felt reassured, as far as this heroic method of solving the problem was concerned. Time passed, night came. The noises in the street ceased. My uncle, bent over his task, didn't notice a thing, not even Martha, half opening the door. And he didn't hear a sound, not even the voice of that worthy human saying, "Will sir not have any supper tonight?" And poor Martha had to go away unanswered. As for me, after a long struggle against it, I was overcome by sleep and dropped off at the end of the sofa, while Uncle Lidenbrock went on calculating and then rubbing out his calculations. When I awoke in the morning, that indefatigable worker was still at his post, his red eyes, his pale complexion, his hair tangled between his feverish fingers. The red spots on his cheeks, all revealed his desperate struggle with this impossible task, and the weariness of spirit and mental exertions he must have undergone all through that unhappy night. To be honest, I pitied him. In spite of reproaching him, which I considered I had every right to do, I was beginning to feel sorry for him to some extent. The poor man was so entirely taken up with this one idea that he had even forgotten how to get angry. The full strength of his feelings was concentrated on one thing alone, and as the usual vent for his feelings was closed, I was afraid that the extreme tension might lead to an explosion sooner or later. With one action, with just one word, I might have loosened the vice of steel that was crushing his brain, but that word I would not speak. Yes, I wasn't a hard-hearted person. Why didn't I stay silent at such a time of crisis? Or was I so insensitive to my uncle's interests? No, I repeated to myself. I'll say nothing. He would insist on going. Nothing on earth could stop him. His imagination is a volcano, and he would risk his life to do something that other geologists have never done. I'll say nothing. I'll keep the secret which mere chance has revealed to me. To reveal it would be to kill Professor Lidenbrock. Let him discover it by himself if he can. I will never have it laid at my door that I led him to his destruction. So resolved, I folded my arms and waited. But I hadn't reckoned on one little incident which transpired a few hours later. When Martha wanted to go to market, she found the door locked. The big key was gone. Who could have taken it out? Undoubtedly it was my uncle, when he had returned the night before from his hasty walk. Had he done it on purpose? Or was it a mistake? Did he want us to suffer starvation? That would be going too far. What, were Martha and I to be the victims of a state of affairs in which we had not the slightest interest? It was true that a few years before this, while my uncle was working at his great classification of minerals, he went 48 hours without eating, and the whole household was obliged to share in this scientific fast. I remember that, for my part, I got severe stomach cramps, which hardly suited the constitution of a hungry, growing boy. Now it seemed that there was going to be no breakfast, just there had been no supper the night before. But I made up my mind to be a hero, and not to give in to the pangs of hunger. Martha took it very seriously, and, poor woman, was very upset. As for me, being unable to leave the house distressed me much more, and for a reason you may well understand. A caged lover's feelings may easily be imagined. My uncle went on working, his imagination rambling through the ideal world of combinations. He was far away from the real world, and far away from worldly needs. About noon, I began to feel real pangs of hunger. Martha had, without thinking anything about it, used up all the food in the larder the night before, so now there was nothing left in the house. Still I held out. I made it a point of honor. The clock struck 2. This was getting ridiculous. No, worse than that, unbearable. I began to tell myself that I was exaggerating the importance of this document, that my uncle would surely not believe what it said, that he would take it as mere nonsense, that if it came to the worst, we would restrain him and keep him at home if he thought of setting out on the expedition. That, after all, he might himself discover the key to the cipher, and that there would then have been no point in my involuntary abstinence. These seemed excellent reasons to me, though I would have rejected them indignantly. The previous night, I even went as far as to condemn myself for the stupidity of having waited so long, and I finally resolved to let my uncle in on the secret. I was wondering how to approach the subject, not wanting to do so too suddenly, when the professor jumped up, put his hat on, and was about to go out. Surely he was not leaving the house and shutting us in again. Oh no, I wasn't having that. "Uncle!" I cried. He seemed not to hear me. "Uncle Lidenbrock!" I cried, raising my voice.
Eh?
He answered, like a man suddenly waking up. "Uncle, the key."
What key? The door key?
"No, no," I cried. "The key to the document." The professor stared at me over his spectacles. No doubt he saw something unusual in my explanation, because he took hold of my arm and wordlessly questioned me with his eyes. Never was a question more forcefully put. I nodded my head. He shook his pityingly, as if he was dealing with a lunatic. I made a more affirmative gesture. His eyes flashed. His hand became threatening. This silent conversation, in such circumstances, would have held the attention of the most indifferent spectator. And the fact really was that I dared not speak now, for fear that my uncle might smother me in his first joyful embraces. But he became so insistent that I was at last obliged to answer. "Yes, that key. Chance—"
What are you saying?
he shouted with the intensity of emotion that is hard to describe. "There, read that," I said, handing him the sheet of paper I had written on.
But there's nothing here,
he answered, crumpling up the paper. "No, nothing, until you read it backwards." I hadn't finished my sentence when the professor gave a cry, or rather a roar. He had seen the light. He was transformed.
"Ah, you clever man, Saknussemm," he cried. "First you wrote your sentence backwards."
And snatching up the paper, with vision blurred, with tears, and a voice choked with emotion, he read the whole document, from the last letter to the first. This is how it went. In Sneffels joculis creturum can delibat, umbra scaterus, Julii intra calendis descende, audas veator, et terrestre centrum attigus, confessi Arna Saknussemm. Which, rather bad Latin, may be translated as follows. Descend into the crater at the yokel of Sneffels, which the shadow of Scarantis touches before the calends of July, and you, bold traveller, will reach the center of the earth, which I, Arna Saknussemm, have done. On reading this, my uncle jumped as if he had touched a Leyden jar. His courage, his joy, and his certainty were magnificent to behold. He walked up and down. He held his head in his hands. He pushed the chairs around. He piled up his books, incredible as it may seem. He even juggled with his precious flint geodes. He punched this and thumped that. Finally, he calmed down and sank back, exhausted, into his armchair.
"What time is it?"
he asked, after a few moments of silence. 3:00, I replied.
"Is it really? Dinner time went by quickly, and I didn't notice. I'm dying of hunger. Come on, and after dinner..."
"Well?"
"After dinner, pack my trunk."
"What?" I cried.
"And yours,"
replied the merciless professor, going into the dining room. Chapter 6. Exciting discussions about a unique undertaking. At these words, a shiver ran through me, but I controlled myself. I even resolved to put a good face on it. Only scientific arguments could have stopped Professor Lidenbrock, and there were good arguments against the practicality of such a journey. To penetrate as far as the center of the earth? What nonsense! But I kept my battery of arguments in reserve for a suitable opportunity, and gave my whole attention to the meal. There would be no point in telling you here of my uncle's anger at oaths when he found himself faced with an empty table. Explanations were given, and Martha was set free again. She ran to the market, and managed so well that an hour later my hunger was assuaged, and I was able to go back to contemplating the gravity of the situation. Throughout dinner, my uncle was almost merry. He indulged in some of those learned jokes which never do anybody any harm. But when the dessert was over, he beckoned me into his study. I obeyed. He sat down at one end of the desk, and I sat down at the other.
"Axel,"
he said, in a kindly voice,
"you're a very clever young man. You've done me a great service, just when, weary of the struggle, I was about to give up. Who knows where I would have ended up? I'll never forget this, and you shall share in the glory to which your discovery will lead."
Right, I thought. He's in a good mood. Now's the time to discuss that very glory.
Most of all, my uncle went on, I must insist on absolute secrecy. You understand? There are not a few people in the world of science who envy me and my success, and many of them would be ready to undertake this journey. Our return must be the first news they make of it.
Do you really think there are many people bold enough? I said.
Certainly. Who would hesitate to gain such fame? If that document became public knowledge, an whole army of geologists would be ready to hasten in the footsteps of Arne Newsom.
I'm not so sure of that, Uncle, I replied, because we've no proof of the authenticity of this document.
What? Given the book we found it in?
All right, I'll admit that Newsom may have written these lines, but does it follow that he really accomplished such a journey? May it not be that this old parchment is simply intended as a joke? I almost regretted having uttered this last word. I said it in an unguarded moment. The professor's shaggy brows formed into a frown, and for a moment I feared for my safety. Luckily, no harm came of it. A vague smile formed on the lips of my stern companion, and he replied,
"That is what we shall see."
"Oh," I said, rather put out, "but do let me go through all the possible objections against this document."
"Speak, my boy, and don't be afraid. You are quite at liberty to express your opinions. You're no longer only my nephew, but my colleague. Please, go on."
"Well, in the first place, I'd like to know what Yokel, Sneffels, and Scartaris are. I've never heard these names before."
"Nothing easier. Not long ago, I received a map from my friend, Augustus Petermann, in Leipzig. I couldn't have come at a better time. Take down the third atlas in the second shelf in the large bookcase. Series Z, shelf 4.
I got up, and with the help of such precise instructions, couldn't fail to find the required atlas. My uncle opened it and said,
"Here is one of the best maps of Iceland, Henderson's, and I think this will provide the answer to all your questions." I bent over the map. "Look at this volcanic Iceland," said the professor. "Notice that all the volcanoes are called jokels, a word which means glacier in Icelandic, and that given the northerly latitude of Iceland, nearly all the active volcanoes discharge through beds of ice. Hence, the term jokel is applied to all the volcanic mountains in Iceland."
"Fine," I said, "but what about Sneffels?" I was hoping that this question would be unanswerable, but I was mistaken. My uncle replied,
"Follow my finger along the west coast of Iceland. Do you see Reykjavik, the capital? You do? Well, move up past the innumerable fjords that indent those sea-beaten shores, and stop at the 65th degree of latitude. What do you see?"
"I can see a peninsula that looks like a thigh bone, with the knee bone at the end of it."
"A very reasonable description, my boy. Now, do you see anything on that knee bone?"
"Yes, a mountain rising out of the sea."
"Right, that's Snæfell."
"That's Snæfell?"
"Yes. It's a mountain 5,000 feet high, and one of the most remarkable in the world, if its crater does lead down to the center of the earth."
"But that's impossible," I said, shrugging my shoulders, furious at such a ridiculous supposition.
"Impossible," said the professor severely. "Why, may I ask?"
"Because the crater would obviously be filled with lava and burning rocks, and therefore—"
"But suppose it's an extinct volcano."
"Extinct?"
"Yes. The number of active volcanoes on the surface of the globe is at the present time only about 300. But there's a very much larger number of extinct ones. Snæfell is one of them. In the historic period, there has been only one eruption of this volcano, in 1219. From then on, it has quieted down more and more, and now it is no longer counted among active volcanoes."
To such definite statements, I could make no reply. I therefore took refuge in other mysterious passages in the document. "What's the meaning of this words, Scartaris? And what have the calends of July got to do with it?" My uncle took a few minutes to consider. For one brief moment, I felt a ray of hope, but it was quickly extinguished, as in a minute he replied with these words.
"What is darkness to you is daylight to me. This shows the care and ingenuity with which Newsom has indicated his discovery. Sneffels, or Snæfell, has several craters.
It was therefore necessary to point out which of these leads to the center of the world. What did the Icelandic sage do? He observed that, at the approach of the calends of July, that is to say, in the last days of June, one of the peaks, called Skartis, threw its shadow down the mouth of that particular crater. And he committed that fact to his document. Could there possibly have been a more exact guide? As soon as we have arrived at the summit of Snæfell, we have need no hesitation over the proper path to take. There was no doubt about it. My uncle had answered every one of my objections. I saw that his position with regard to the old parchment was impregnable. I therefore stopped pressing him on that part of the subject, and since the most important thing was to convince him, I moved on to scientific objections, which, in my opinion, were far more serious. "All right, then," I said. "I'm forced to admit that Saknussemm's sentence is clear and leaves no room for doubt. I will even allow that the document bears every mark and evidence of authenticity. That learned philosopher did get to the bottom of Sneffels. He has seen the shadow of Scartaris touch the edge of the crater before the calends of July. He may even have heard legends told in his day about that crater reaching to the center of the world. But as for reaching himself, for making the journey and returning, if he ever went, I say no. He never ever did that." "And what reason do you have for saying that?" said my uncle in a mocking tone. "All the theories of science declare such a feat to be impracticable." "The theories say that, do they?" replied the professor, in an affable tone. "Oh, those nasty theories. Those theories will really hold us back, won't they?" I could see that he was just laughing at me, but I continued all the same. "Yes, it's perfectly well known that the internal temperature of the Earth rises by 1 degree for every 70 feet you go down from the surface. Now, admitting this proportion to be constant, and the radius of the Earth being 1,500 leagues, there must be a temperature of more than 200,000 degrees at the center of the Earth. Therefore, all the substances that compose this body of this Earth must exist there in a state of incandescent gas, for the metals that most resist the action of heat, gold and platinum, and the hardest of rocks, can never be solid or even liquid at such a temperature. I have therefore a perfectly good reason for asking if it is possible to penetrate through such a medium." "So, Axel, it's the heat that's bothering you." "Of course it is. Were we to reach a depth of even 25 miles, we would arrive at the limit of the terrestrial crust, because there the temperature would be more than 1,300 degrees. "And you're afraid of being melted?" "I'll leave it to you to answer that question," I replied rather sullenly. "This is my answer," replied Professor Lidenbrock, putting on one of his grandest airs. "Neither you nor anybody else knows with any certainty what is going on in the interior of the Earth, since it is not a 12,000th part of its radius is known. Science is always improvable, and every new theory is soon driven out by a yet newer one. Was it not always believed until Fourier that the temperature of interplanetary space decreased indefinitely? And is it not now known that the greatest cold of the ethereal regions is never lower than 40 or 50 degrees below zero? Why should it not be the same with the internal heat? Why should it not be the case that, at a certain depth, it reaches an impassable limit, instead of rising to such a point as to melt the most solid metals?" Since my uncle was now talking hypotheses, there was of course nothing to be said. "Well, I will tell you that true men of science, among them Poisson, have demonstrated that if a heat of 200,000 degrees existed in the interior of the globe, the fiery gases arising from the fused matter would acquire a force that the crust of the Earth would be unable to resist, and that it would explode like the plates of a bursting boiler. That is Poisson's opinion, uncle, nothing more. Granted, but it is likewise the opinion of other distinguished geologists that the interior of the globe is neither gas nor water, nor any of the heaviest minerals known, for in none of these cases would the Earth weigh what it does." "Oh, you can prove anything with figures, but it's the same with facts. Is it not known that the number of volcanoes has decreased since the first days of creation? And if there is central heat, may we not therefore conclude that it too is decreasing?" "My dear uncle, you're entering the realms of speculation. There's nothing more to be said." "But I have to tell you that the greatest names have come round to supporting my views. Do you remember a visit paid to me by the celebrated chemist Humphrey Davis in 1825? Not at all, since I wasn't born until 19 years after that. Well, Humphrey Davy did call on me on his way through Hamburg. We spent a long time discussing, amongst other problems, the hypothesis of the liquid structure of the nucleus of the Earth. We agreed that it couldn't be in a liquid state, for the reason which science has never been able to confute. What is that reason? I said, rather astonished. Because this liquid mass would be subject, like the ocean, to lunar attraction, and therefore twice every day there would be internal tides which, by pushing up the terrestrial crust, would cause regular earthquakes. Yes, it's evident that the surface of the globe has been subject to the action of fire, I replied, and it is quite reasonable to suppose that the external crust cooled down first, whilst the heat took refuge down at the center. Unfortunately, that's about what we have time for today, so we're going to leave off just partway through this chapter and partway through their argument. But we'll be picking up shortly. Thank you very much for reading, and next time we'll finish that chapter of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Have a great day.